Are markets right to be pricing in a bit more caution on the back of this news that China is narrowing the scope in terms of these trade negotiations in Washington?
I don't think anybody really expected a breakthrough even before this news had been released. Even so, this underlines the fact that whatever they agree or whatever news that would be released later this week would likely be fragile and unsustainable, because this is really more of a Band-Aid solution to something that really requires an operation.
Eugenia, what does this mean in terms of business sentiment? If we do get some kind of interim deal on the back of these discussions in Washington, even if the scope has been narrowed, can business sentiment improve to the point where investment decisions come back into play for businesses that have been keeping cash on the sidelines?
Not necessarily. It's probably enough to keep the equity market supported, but it's not likely to take out the long-term uncertainty. We've already seen a pullback in investment plans, specifically by foreign firms in China, and that's not likely to be pulled back anytime soon. In fact, what is more likely is that people will just assume that this is the new norm and that any headway that we will be able to see would be very, very fragile and not enough to put all your bets on.
And Lindsey, jump in here right now, because given the geopolitical risk we've seen out there, the fact that the Chinese are considering possibly narrowing the scope and they only want a limited trade deal, where does Huawei fit into all this? Will the U.S. continue to use, or will they use Huawei as a bargaining chip?
I think that the challenge right now when we're looking at Huawei is the U.S. government has put a pretty extensive pressure campaign on Huawei, and there are deep concerns both in the legislative branch and the executive branch about the potential security risks that Huawei poses. Unfortunately, the president's own inconsistency and the U-turns that we've seen him take in being on the same page as a lot of his executive agencies has undermined the government's ability to really take a consistent stance on Huawei. And I think that, in turn, leads the Chinese government to gamble that essentially they can go directly to the president, as you saw the talks with Xi Jinping and President Trump at the G20, and they can use that to try to get pressure off of Huawei.
Right. Am I right to assume then, Lindsey, that if they can go the direct route, Xi to Trump, and we've sort of seen that in the lead up to the 70th anniversary of China, when China asked something, they give in a little bit, that Donald Trump will give in to what Xi Jinping wants and asks?
You know, with this president, one is always gambling a bit to say that you know exactly where he may be at any moment. But I think China has reason to believe that the direct route to the president is their best bet. And I think, you know, they're watching very closely what's happening domestically right now. And more than likely, there's a bit of an estimation here on the Chinese side that the president is in a difficult political situation at home, and that he may need this deal worse than them right now.
Well, Lindsey, just following up on that, is that assumption by China, if it is an assumption by the authorities in Beijing and the negotiating team here, that Trump is weakened as a result of this impeachment inquiry, is that assumption playing out? Is that accurate, do you think, in your view? Is Trump in a weaker position?
Well, certainly the president's in a challenging domestic position politically right now. And I don't think it's a stretch to say that he sees his political future as quite closely tied to the domestic economy and how the domestic economy is doing. However, the president's been pretty consistent about one thing, which is his desire for a trade deal. So if there's anything where you're likely to see the president be more firm, it may be on the issue of trade.
Right. And Eugenia, let me bring you in there to that point of Lindsey. Economically, we know there's a slowdown going on in China, and part of that is almost self-engineered. Do you think the Chinese are still negotiating from a position of weakness?
Well, clearly, the Chinese authorities' focus on stability and the quality of growth has really kept their policy more targeted rather than an aggressive policy. Having said that, it is more likely that the Chinese authorities would need to swallow or at least agree to sub 6% growth prints at least up until 2020. So at this point, considering that the structural reforms are at the forefront of their minds, I would be expecting that the negotiations from the Chinese side would be focusing on the long-term issues.